Thanks everybody for attending. This, of course, as you know, is the fiction seminar with Shanna Germain, which is part of which spun out of the Numenera 2 Kickstarter campaign last fall, and all of the great contributions we were seeing from the gamers who supported the campaign. We just thought that this was something people would be interested in. Shanna, of course, is a very accomplished fiction writer. So. My name is Charles Ryan. I'm the COO at Monte Cook Games. I'm going to be taking your questions out of chat and passing them on to Shauna as she is ready to receive them. But that's pretty much all I have to say. Other than that, I'll pass it right on over to Shauna, and she'll take it from here.
Cool. Hi, guys. So this is the first time I've ever taught a class where I can't see all of your faces. So you'll have to send me emojis or something so I know like where things are landing, and I'll pretend they're your faces. This is going to be so much fun. We're going to do 2 hours of, I'm just going to fill your brains with everything that I can. We'll take a break on the hour. Of course, I can't tell if you're here or not, so you can take a break whenever you like. Just don't tell me. No, I'm kidding. But we'll take a break on the hour. I have given you guys some 2 small handouts. Charles, where would they find those if they haven't already?
Give me just a minute. I'll post a link in the chat.
Okay, perfect. So one is just the writing seminar outline, which we may or may not stick to. I'm going to kind of leave that up a little bit to you guys. And the other is some favorite writing resources. I'm going to wait till Charles links that, and then I'm going to add a few more things that I forgot to that resource list. Now that I've put Charles on the spot and given him pressure. Go, Charles, go.
Sorry, I should have grabbed the link before we got started, and it just slipped my mind. But they're already in the folder. I just have to grab the link to it. And there it is.
Perfect. Okay, so you should be able to go there and just pick those up. Let's do, so we're going to do 2 things. I'm going to talk very briefly. Oh, thank you. I'm going to talk very briefly about the my favorite writing resources. Most of them are self-explanatory, so I don't want to spend too much time on it because you guys can Google those kinds of things. Once you grab them, we'll go through them. And for now, I wanted to add kind of 3 books to that resource list. And I will add them to the file at the end so that if you re-download it, you'll have them. But one is, is this going to work? Yes. The Art of Slow Writing. I don't know about you guys, but I'm a very slow writer. I work on a team with Monty, Bruce, and Sean, who are all really fast writers, and it can kind of be a little bit of an ego kill to realize that it's taken me, twice or 3 times as long to write stuff. And this talks about why being a slow writer is not a bad thing, how you can utilize it. And so I found this really, really useful if you are a slow writer. This is kind of a great tool to have at your side and just pick up and read every once in a while. And then the other one is a pretty recent book. It's called Damn Fine Story. It's by Chuck Wendig, who you guys probably have read something of or know about. He writes some Star Wars stuff as well as the Miriam Black books, like Blackbird. And this book in particular talks about kind of creating tension and the way in which you can keep your readers engaged. And it's really a quick read. It's good for that kind of stuff. All right. So does everybody have the writing resource list? I'm going to just wait for a couple of thumbs up. I know it's hard to go link and watch. Okay. All right, cool. All right, so the way that this is going to work is I'm going to talk your ear off for a little while, and then we're going to do some questions, and then I'm going to save a big time at the end for Q&A. And the reason for that is because a lot of times you walk in the door with questions, but then also questions come up as I talk at you. And so I want a chance to answer both of those kinds of questions, the ones that you show up with and the ones that sort of arise as you're listening. So the writing resource, I'm just going to talk about why I use them. I wouldn't get too caught up on tools. The important thing is like finding a tool that works for you. I really like Scrivener. There's all kinds of resources online about why. But for me, it allows me to organize my work in a way that's really easy. I can cut and paste images in there for inspiration. You can get it, like I can use it on my iPad and on all my computers, so it's very great and easy. I know a lot of people use Word, some people use Google Docs. Like, it doesn't matter what tool you use as long as it works for you. It's when I first started writing, I got really hung up in like, what am I writing in, and does it matter? And it turned out that it did, but I didn't want to. I shouldn't have spent so much time thinking that I needed the right tool in order to start writing. And then freedom and self-control are get off the internet apps that I use a lot. It's really easy to think that you're writing and then suddenly realize you've been on Twitter for 20 minutes. And so these apps both keep you from doing that. You basically block the sites. And then when you open a tab and you're like Twitter, they're like, nope, you can't go there. It's really lovely for productivity. I keep a bullet journal. I've written about this before and talked about a bullet journal. It basically, under all these notes, basically looks like this. And it has tabs for all of the different projects that I'm working on. It allows me to keep everything like in here. I keep my goals, which we'll talk about goals in a little bit. I keep my goals in here. I keep my submissions in here. I keep whatever I'm working on. They're easy to find. Like I said, you can find a ton about bullet journals online, but I find it's a super useful resource. It goes everywhere with me. If I leave without my bullet journal and I realize I'm out in public, it never ever, like, it always happens that there's something I should have written down and brought with me and remembered. So so that's a huge thing. I also use Evernote, but there's a few others. Google Keep, Bear, those are all popular for keeping track of just those ideas, those things that you think, oh, someday, but that just get lost. Jordan, I will come back to that. Thank you. That's a good question. And then Pinterest, I think, is a great resource if you don't fall down that rabbit hole. I use it a lot for creating a storyboard image. If you go to my Pinterest page, you can see that I have like a whole storyboard for different novels that I've worked on. I have one for The Poison Eater and The Nightclave and various novels that I've written through my life. And you even do it for short stories, just to get inspiration and ideas. And then Story Clock Notebook, which is something that's pretty new. It came out this year. I find it really useful. They did a Kickstarter for it. And if you have trouble sort of figuring out the shape of your stories or the shape of the thing that you want to write, I highly recommend it. We'll talk a little bit about shape because you may not know yet whether this is something you have trouble with. And then writing books. Those are just some of the writing books that really help me. They're all on my shelves. I use them all the time. My screen just went dark. Help! What happened? Oh, okay. Charles says I don't look any different. Everything is dead on my screen, so I'm just going to keep talking until Charles tells me otherwise. Okay. Yay! All right, so that's great. I'm glad that you guys don't see this very derpy photo that ended up cutting off right at that point, because that I don't think you could watch a whole class that way. Okay, so, and then online resources, again, these are things I use regularly. They are the things that I keep off of freedom and self-control so that I can access them even when I'm writing. And then online reading, I'm assuming, and that might not be right, that you guys are interested in things like sci-fi, spec fic, fantasy, and these are mostly those kinds of short story markets, plus a few more literary things or things that are a little esoteric or a little horror focused. So those are all just some of my resources that I use. So what I would like to do before I start blabbing at you guys about writing is tell me two things, each of you, if you don't mind. What's the thing that you want to write? And this, maybe you don't know this, and that's totally okay. Maybe it's many things like novels and short stories and poetry. Maybe it's something that you haven't quite figured out, or it's a little bit of those. I would like to know that, and I would also like to know what you think your weakness is as a writer. Like, what's the thing that you would hope to learn by the time we hit 7 o'clock here? And you guys can just put those in chat if you wouldn't mind. And yes, okay. I think, however, that my chat is frozen as part of this being frozen. So I don't know that I can see your chat currently.
Okay, well, I will be happy to pass on questions as they're posted in the chat for you.
Okay, that would be great, because I cannot see, I don't think I can see anything. I was thinking about refreshing, but do you think that'll bonk the event?
I would hesitate to do that. It would, I honestly have no idea.
Okay.
Here's what we got. Michelle tells us she's interested in turning essays, poetry, and fiction into performance. Keith Garrett says he wants to write his own RPG, and his weakness is procrastination. Who among us doesn't suffer from that? Jordan Shively says that they want to focus on writing short stories and game world lore. Weaknesses are focus and time management. Darcy Ross is over here with John Harness and she wants to write a magical realist memoir. That's kind of cool.
Oh,
Weakness is dialogue. I'm going to ask people to slow down just a little bit here because it's scrolling up faster than I can sort of pass these things on. Stormquist wants to write novels. His greatest weakness is creating tension. That's fantastic. That'd be a great one to learn more about. Liam Morse wants to write novels, maybe screenplays, tabletops, games, and game scenarios. Anestus says a book or two and RPG adventures and settings. Weaknesses is setting time to write. Another one that affects all of us. Michelle says weakness is structure. AJ wants to do short stories, having difficulty expanding stories once written. Brian Crucitti would like to write fantasy novels. Says one of his major weaknesses is in cutting out fluff and minutia. When he writes stories, character conversations tend to keep going and going. Catherine Goring, novels, weaknesses are writer's block. Laura says, I do write a lot of RP. I enjoy writing scenes and world building and would like to write fiction, short length. Weakness is turning points into developed text. Brian Kurtz, what I want to write is narrative fiction for young people, possibly middle grade novel. My weakness is I fear I may not have the creative writer I want to be in me, as I've only done scientific writing so far. So if I can put words in his mouth, a little bit afraid that he may not have what it takes. William Morse adds to what she said above, that weakness is finishing anything. How do you finish a story? Ryan Lilstrom, I'm very sorry if I got that wrong, Ryan. His goal is writing campaigns that are engaging and weakness is fleshing out ideas. Andre says, personally I enjoy and am quite good in writing informative material for world building, creating fictional worlds or situations. I would really love to come out of here with more and have more on the line of coming up with amazing stories that take place in the worlds I come up with. John Neary says, fiction and short stories, anything really, RPGs. Weakness, getting back to the keyboard and keeping up the momentum. That's a bit of a theme there. Michael says, one, a non-cipher high fantasy origin of magic novel and a Numenera novel dealing with Drit alchemy, and also in the Procrastination Club. Anestus has added a weakness to what he said above. Dialogue, tend to do he said, she said, he exclaimed stuff. I'd like to kind of mix that up, I guess, a little bit. And Carol Ann Stockton says that she'd like to write novels, thinks her biggest weakness is wrapping up stories in finite chunks. So that's where we are so far. There may be a few more going to pipe in. We'll see how it goes, but that should give us enough to get started with. And there are some themes there, I think.
There are. These are the eternal writer themes. Okay, this is glorious. All right, I'm very excited because I know how to talk about all these things. So if you guys had come up with something that I hadn't already struggled through, I'd be... So I wanted to talk for 1 second some specific resources for people who mentioned a few things. The Art of Language Invention is in my resource list, but for those of you who are world building, this is the gentleman who did Horse Lords and Dark Elves. He did the Game of Thrones stuff. He did the the really fantastic sci-fi space, The Expanse. He did the Belter language for The Expanse, which is glorious if you want to learn a really cool way of doing language. This is a great book to help create immersive settings. Wired for Story is great for tension. Can I make that so you can see it? Nope. It's great for tension and also for form. I know somebody mentioned form being a tricky space. And then, sorry, for those of you who I'm going to recommend this one to, because it's a giant brick stop. Robert McKee's Story is the best book I've ever read on structure. I've read this book like 3 or 4 times. I know it says it's for screenwriting, but that doesn't matter. And every time I feel like I still don't get it all, which is amazing. So this is a fantastic, fantastic resource. And these are all old enough that you can probably find them like in the library as well if you're on a tight budget. So that's great. Okay, cool. So let's go down the syllabus. Some things I'm gonna do really fast because A, they're either less important or they don't really talk to the things that you guys have mentioned. But then I'm going to take a break after each major chunk and see if you guys have additional questions. So doing the words, this is a big one. A lot of people have said that actually doing the words, getting to the keyboard, finishing a thing, finding time, these are all super, super hard parts of a writer's life. And one of the things that is really important to think about is there are no finite answers. Being a creative person means being in a field where no one can actually tell you how to do anything. And that is incredibly frustrating, especially if you're just like, please tell me the answer. I really want to know how to do this. So what I'm going to give you are things that you can try that might just be that perfect key for you. And for me, I have a lot of keys and they change over time. And so some of the things that have worked for me in terms of getting through are like throwing out all the rules. And I'll talk a lot about rules probably through this because there are tons and tons of rules about how to be a writer. And most of them are bullshit. I'm sorry to say. Like, the only rules are the rules that work for you. And so like look at everything and say, does this work for me? And then decide if it's a rule that you want. The most common one is cut out all your adverbs, to which I say, no, don't do that. It's all a gray area. Decide which adverbs you want to keep and keep them dearly. So rules like, do you have to write every day? No, I don't write every day. I've probably never written every day in my whole career, even though there was probably a time when I would have said that I did. I just don't work like that, but some people do. I know like Bruce Cordell, he writes his number of words every single day and he's really great about it. And he's like a workhorse and he's amazing in that way. But I work in a squishier space. I tend to get, there might be 4 or 5 days where I don't write anything. And if you're a person who has a harder time coming back to the keyboard, that's a really tricky way to work. So people if you have a hard time coming to the keyboard, try every day, even if it's only 20 words. Like it's the process, not the word count. Carving out time is a really tricky one, and that's tied into knowing when your hotspot is. And what I mean by this is, like, think of it like a Wi-Fi signal. You walk around the house and you find or the restaurant, you find the best place for the Wi-Fi signal where you get the most speed, everything's the fastest, it's the clearest. This is your writing time, whether it's first thing in the morning or last thing in the evening or sometime. I have a friend that has written whole novels, she has kids, like during laundry, she goes down to the laundry room and she writes longhand because it's the only time that she can get away where kids don't need her and family and work doesn't need her. And so she's written whole novels in her basement while doing laundry because it's like this space that has worked for her. And so I think that finding your hotspot, when can you be most productive? And I would try everything, 3 in the morning, or I know that like morning is my time, but not before 10 a.m. because I'm totally dysfunctional. And a lot of this is experiment. Be willing to experiment and see, can you get a lot done on your lunch hour? Because there's this stress. Can you get a little bit done while you're waiting in the car to, in the parking lot to pick somebody up? Sometimes those tiny small amounts can work really well. On the other hand, there are people who need huge chunks of time to immerse and submerge into a thing. And so if you're one of those people who needs huge chunks of time, you have to figure out how to get that. Do you take a writing retreat? Do you do something else? And then rewards, I think, are a huge one. My reward is a soy mocha. If I get X number of words done, I can have a soy mocha. I've used other rewards over my life, but that's been the one that's consistently good. The women in my writing group do Advent calendars for their books, and so as soon as they finish a chapter, they get a thing, whether that's chocolate or a bubble bath or a night out at dinner or just 5 minutes alone, whatever the thing is that really motivates you. Give yourself rewards. You cannot over reward yourself for work that you're doing. We talked about tools a little bit. Make sure that you don't overthink tools, but use tools that make your job easier as you find them. And then goals. The only way that I get anything done ever is goals and deadlines. I really need deadline pressure, but deadline pressure can be a thing that stops you too. You're going to find that the theme of my How to Be a Writer is know thyself, and this is part of knowing thyself. So does deadline pressure make you freeze up, or does it make you feel like, okay, I can do this, I have an end? And the worst thing that you can do for yourself is set goals that you won't meet. And the reason for that is because you'll miss the first goal. You're like, I'm going to write 2,000 words a day. And you'll miss it because it just doesn't work like that. If you haven't been writing, you can't jump into something like 2,000 words. And so the first time you miss it, you'll start thinking, oh, I can never do this. This isn't going to work. So set your goal way lower than you think. Set your goal for write 200 words a day. That's it. Because you'll succeed and you'll do it. And then tomorrow you'll do it again. Or whatever your goal is, just make sure that you are setting it so that it feels kind of ridiculously low. And I think that that is one of the keys, this psychology of finding a way through that. What else about, let's talk really briefly. Do you guys have questions, more questions specifically, less about sort of the craft of writing and more specifically about sitting down, getting it done, finding time? Like what are those big ones? Charles, I can read the screen now too.
Okay, terrific. Well, if you need me to come in and manage questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll be in the background.
Thank you. I think my screensaver popped up and that's what screwed it all up. So. I see typing, so I'm going to wait, see if people have questions. That's a good question. Oh, the question is, if you guys had any other questions about getting the words done. What do you do when you sit down to write and words don't come? That's a really good question. There are multiple ways to handle this. For me, the way I handle it is actually twofold. One is I have multiple projects going. And so if the words don't come, I switch to a different project and see if the words come on that project. And a lot of times my projects aren't even things that are official. They're just me noodling, like, oh, you know, I read this thing, I want to sit down and write about this and see kind of how I feel about it. So that's one way, is I switch projects. The other way is I force myself to sit there, because eventually I'm going to get so freaking bored that I'm going to start writing something, even if it's nonsense. And that's that's the hardest thing, especially with things like Twitter, or like just suddenly you're looking at a thing that you didn't. So I just force myself to sit here and I stare at the words that I've already written, or I stare at the blank page. Some people that probably would not work for, but I find that at some point I start writing because it's better than being bored. I also think that thinking ahead about what you're going to write can help you with the words coming. So if you're like, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write about X, or I want to try this, I want to experiment with this. There are also a ton of resources out there. Just like look up writing exercises, or like starter writing exercises to get like prompts, because they can sometimes just prompt a thing and get you going. I also use Pinterest sometimes for like ideas. I'll be like, oh, look at that character, I want to write something about them, and it kicks that off. All right, I'm going to keep going quick. How does writing as part of a team affect your motivation? Does it? That's a good question. It actually adds a lot of pressure for me, but I think that's not true for everyone. I find it really hard to show my early drafts because they don't feel finished, and it's like a very fragile thing until I'm ready to show it. And so working as part of a team affects me in a negative way sometimes, because I don't want to expose my heart, right? We're all afraid of exposing our hearts. But at the same time, it's taught me that exposing our heart is the way to get better and make better sort of connections, I guess. So so working as part of a team motivates me to be more open with my work, which probably isn't what you're asking, but that's kind of where that comes. Okay, so many questions. Okay. Is there a trick to organizing projects and managing the guilt of having said yes to too many projects? I wish there was. No, there probably is. My trick for organizing project is Scrivener. And in Scrivener, I include all the information about that particular project. I also use my bullet journal. And in my bullet journal, each project gets a tab and a double-spaced page that's all about, like, here's everything about this project that I'm ever going to know. It's deadline and word count and what I'm getting paid and when it's due and who it's due to. And so then I can just flip to that and I have that as a resource. So that's how I manage my projects in that way, or organize my projects. Managing the guilt is communication, I think, and saying, hey, I'm going to be late. I've overbooked on this thing. Or like communication is the best way for me to alleviate a sense of falling behind or failing someone else. All right. Some of the ways to build or find, a writing community. That's a great question. I think that taking classes, local classes, is great because you're finding people who are probably at your level and who are interested in craft or interested in learning. One of the hardest things to find are people that want to get better rather than just want to be published. And those are two really different mindsets. And you can want them both. But for a group, what you're looking for is people who want to get better because they will help you get better. And I think libraries often do, bookstores often do gatherings of writers who want to come together. I think the community colleges are a great place to find all this stuff. There's some really great online resources. Codex is a good one, and I think Zoetrope is still around. That is an online resource as well. And there's Critters, and then there's another one that I can't remember the name of, but I will think of it and I will add it to the resource list when I remember it. And for support and motivate, you have to trust that people have your best interest at heart. And so if you don't feel supported and motivated, get out is my sort of short answer to that. Like if you're in a place where people aren't supporting and motivating you, you might not be in the right group. But I think that one of the ways to get the best support is to know clearly what you need to be supported in and communicate that with whoever you're interacting with. And so like, I'm not looking for feedback because I feel really sensitive about this still. But what I really want is someone to tell me the good things that are working. Like that kind of communication can help make sure that you're getting the kind of feedback you need until you're ready for a different kind of feedback. All right, I'm gonna just go through some of these so we don't get stuck on this too much. Finishing is a problem. Forcing yourself to finish, yes. I'm gonna talk about finishing at the end for sure, but I think for me, the trick to finishing a thing is to tell myself that it's okay that it's shitty. And I just need to finish it. And it's never, like, for me, the reason I don't finish thing is fear that it's not going to be perfect. But of course it's not going to be perfect, right? It's just, like, as soon as you put your first word on the page, it is never as good as what you imagined. Nothing is ever perfect. And so convincing myself that it's okay to have an imperfect draft is really the way that I can finish a thing. Plus, reward. Rewards are the big one. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about finishing at the end too. Space battles. I don't know about that one, but I like the name. Yeah, being too brain burnt is tricky. And I find that for me, that's why writing in the morning is better. And I actually save my email when I do it. I work really hard to do this, but I fail. I try to save my email and my small tasks for later in the day because I am brain burnt by that point, and so I can do those. It's funny because at MCG we actually talk about like trying to put our important big projects first or focus on them, right? Because it's really easy to sort of be like, oh, well, I've got all these emails, so I'm just going to do them and get them out of the way, and then I'm going to write. And writing just always takes the back seat, and so putting it first, I think, is really the way to get that done when your brain's still hot, if that's your time. Like I know that Monty only writes after midnight. Like that is his time. He does not function in the morning. His brain doesn't work, so he has no desire to do writing my way. So finding out when that time is, yeah, not having enough spoons is really tricky. You know, I think that the Art of Slow Writing is a really good resource for that. It actually talks about writing with chronic illness and pacing. And, you know, it's something I thought about. I had Lyme disease for about a year that really just left me unable to write at all and was really, really devastating to me, like emotionally, because I couldn't do the thing that I thought that I was here to do. And so I think being kind to myself and finding really small moments, and also getting someone else to like take a spoon for me is really hard. Like, so passing a thing off to someone else is not a thing that comes naturally to me, but at some point I had to start doing that so that I could find time to write. And so like if you can find a way to pass something off, even just emotionally, I think that sometimes is really helpful. And having people who support you and understand that the experience that you're going through, I think is sometimes that feels, at least to me, like it's giving me a little bit of extra energy and space. But yeah, I would recommend the Art of Slow Writing, because she does. Sorry, I don't know how to make it so it's not so shiny. She does talk quite a bit about finding extra space and time, particularly in chronic illnesses in here, and I think it's really useful. Okay, do you find that making a clean space from your home to work helps? Yeah, if I'm cleaning the fridge, I'm on deadline. I find that having a ritual helps. It doesn't matter where I am. It's a ritual for me of like I make a very specific drink that is part of my writing ritual. I play specific music. I didn't really talk about the importance of music into getting into your space. I use an app called Calm too that plays like trance music or like chimes or gongs or angel choirs. And each book for me has a different music that gets me into it, or each project. And so I listened to that for like 5 minutes silently, not doing any work. And I find that often that helps me emotionally transition out of a space, even if I'm not physically transitioning. So I think rituals are a really good way to leave the world behind if you can. Okay. All right. All right. We're going to move on to craft. Okay. So craft is one of my favorite things to talk about. So I'm going to try very hard not to get long-winded. But the first thing I'm going to say is ignore all the advice you've ever heard, except for this one. And that is because if you read, people will tell you all the things that you can't do as a writer, and I call bullshit. And in fact, I use that as a challenge to say, you know what, then I'm going to do that. And here's why I say this, because advice is how one writer works. It isn't how you as a writer works. And so while that advice might work for you, if you assume that it's the only truth and it doesn't work for you, you're not going to think that you can be a writer. And that's not the way that it works. So like if someone is very adamant that this is the only way to write or you can't do this, I would be cautious of taking that advice too close to heart. And so I would say listen to all the advice they get and decide if it's right for you. Because some things just aren't. I am a very wordy sort of, I don't want to say hallmarky because that has a negative taste, but I'm a very I really like playing around with words. I like etymology, I like language, I like lyricism. And you know, there are people who, when I first started writing, would say, take out all your adjectives and all your adverbs. And that wasn't the kind of writing that I wanted to make. What I needed to do was to learn how to use my adverbs and adjectives wisely. But the people giving me advice didn't understand what I was going for well enough to help me in that way. So some of it is helping yourself by figuring out how the rules actually apply to what you're trying to do. So that's my big piece. Listen to all the advice, think about if it's right for you. But there are some things that I think are hard to do. And so I labeled this what not to do and how to do it anyway. But really what I want you to think about is like some of the biggest pieces, some of the really common advice, right? So the common advice is don't have your character wake up and start their morning. And so think about why that is. Like, why do people give you that advice? And it's because it's a boring person doing a boring thing. And boring people doing boring things aren't why we read fiction. Now, there are some fantastic stories of characters waking up and starting their day. Think of Kafka's Cockroach, right? He wakes up as a cockroach. I mean, that breaks the rules right there. But because it's so weird and different, it works. And so think about the reason behind the rule and decide if that works for you. Other rules are things like, God, what are the other rules, you guys, that you've heard? I'll see if I can break them down for you. I keep putting you guys on the spot. Oh, adverbs are the enemy, right? That's a good one. I'll break that down too. Oh, these are good. Okay, I'm going to start talking while you guys are writing. So adverbs are the enemy. So the reason that people say this is because there is often a better word. So he ran fast. There's a better word for that. He sped. He raced, right? But there's also a time when you want to use, it's also like the passive voice. There are people who are like, never use the passive voice. But there are reasons for it sometimes. And so deciding why you want to do that, why does that specific word for sped, why does that not work? Why do you need to say he ran quickly? And sometimes that's, again, like it's just a sort of really what you want to say and how you want to say it. So if you don't know that there's a better word for ran quickly or a more concise word, that's different than purposefully choosing that word. All right. And then avoid tropes and cliches. Right. So this is actually a pretty good one because the tropes, like, here's the problem with avoiding tropes is that tropes are actually what stories are built on, right? So we think about fairy tales. The rule of three is a trope, but it's such an important part of how we understand and engage with stories that to get rid of it entirely would actually, we would lose something, right? Not just, I mean, it's like you try a thing twice and you know by the third time it's going to succeed. But think about a story where you try a thing 3 times and then it succeeds on the fourth. Doesn't that feel weird? Like that feels awkward. And it's because like 3-act structures, like threes, like there's an essence to why that matters in stories. And so tropes and cliches are tricky because you don't want to just make them as they are, but if you take them out entirely and don't work with them, you really lose a lot in what we understand of stories. And don't switch point of view too often. Yeah, it really depends on what kind of book you're writing, doesn't it? Because some books need multiple point of views. So let's talk about point of view really quick. I'm going to jump right into that because I think it's interesting. So point of view is one of those things that goes in and out of style on a marketing side. And there's no reason for it other than marketing. Every story needs a different way of using point of view. So some stories need to be told entirely in first person. I did this, I went to the store, I did this, I did that. And the reason for that is because it needs to be in the head of the person telling you everything. Some stories you need to have lots and lots of points of view because it's a collective story. It's being told to a group about a group. And so you need to be inside the heads of all of these people. Now, omniscient, which is a narrator up here telling this group story, used to be super popular and is not anymore. We almost never see omniscient narrators in modern fiction unless they are emulating something, rewriting Frankenstein or something like that. It's just out of fashion. It might come back into fashion or it might not. I don't know. Okay, you guys have lots of these. This is great. All right, cut 30% of whatever you've written. Someone was just recommending, I think I actually put it on the list, the 10% solution, which is sort of about cutting what you've written. So I'm a putter-inner. I'm going to throw some words at you. And some people are taker-outers. And as a putter-inner, my first draft is about a third of the length that it needs to be. So when I go back and do a revision, I end up taking a 1,000-word story and making it 3,000 words because that's how I work. Some people are taker-outers, and so for those people, that 30% rule does apply because they've overwritten, they've stretched it out, they've made it too slow, they've added their scaffolding, which is sort of the like, hey, I'm the writer and I don't know what I'm writing about, so I'm writing all of these things to kind of see what I'm writing about, but then I forgot to take them out. You've probably read those books where you're like, I don't think that needed to be in there. And so those are the people who do need to take that 30% out. But if you're a putter-inner and your first drafts are sparse, then you need to go the opposite way, and you need to put 30% or 50% or whatever back in. Show, don't tell. Let's see. Avoid exposition. Don't make your readers think too much. Oh man, that one bugs me. Don't make your readers think. What do you think they're here for? Okay. All right. So, oh yeah, the Broken Earth trilogy totally does that. Also, Amy Bloom is an author who changes POVs like in the middle of a story in this amazing way that I wish I could steal. All right, so I'm going to talk quickly about which two? Show, don't tell, and avoid exposition, because these are really important, particularly as we're looking at game writing and world building, all these kinds of things. Let's do avoid exposition first. So exposition is where you say to your reader, hey reader, here's some information that you need to know. And sometimes this is world building, sometimes this is facts, sometimes this is the thing that happened, in someone's past, and it gets a bad rap for being boring. But that's because some people do it, and it's super boring. It's like, you can listen to things online that are like, so Bob, I went down to the store. Yeah, Eric, how was it? well, Bob, right? And so you get these two characters talking like no one ever talks in their whole life, just so the writer can give you information. And so that's the kind of exposition that you want to avoid. However, so if you want to look at great exposition, I would recommend the Expanse books. He threads his exposition through his characters' viewpoints and movements and actions so beautifully that you don't even know you're learning. Also, this fantastic book, The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, exposition, you don't even notice. It's so beautifully done. Those are two great ones. And then Show Don't Tell. So with Show Don't Tell, it's actually what they're actually talking about is exposition. They're kind of the same, right? Because what you want to do is you want to have your character take an action that shows a fact, right? And so the way to do this, here's one of my big secrets, is objects. Because objects have so much meaning. So if you give your character a pen, let's just say a pen, right? You give your character a pen, and we know from early in the story that this pen was given to them by someone they adore or love or who's dead or who they had a crush on forever and it was unrequited, any of these things. And then they go pick up this pen to sign something emotional. And we're connected to this pen, to that emotional space that they had in the very beginning of the book or the story. And suddenly this action where they go and sign a thing has all this emotion and all this connection. And so when you're doing exposition, it is a glorious pen. So when you're doing exposition and when you're doing show don't tell, one of the ways to do that is through objects. Think about the objects that you're using, the objects that your characters own, the things that you're describing. It's so weird, but when I was in high school, I can remember reading a story and the teacher was like, that black crow stands for blah, blah, blah. And I was like, no, it doesn't. That writer just thought black crows were cool. And it turned out that it really does stand for this thing because the author had worked all of that in the beginning about what that meant. So that's my biggest trick. And so now when you watch a show or watch a movie, look at the objects and see how they're using them. I mean, even Lord of the Rings is a perfect example because we get like this ring that is the object and it carries so much. So look at objects. When you read, look at objects. When you watch movies and shows, look at all these objects. I don't know if you guys have watched like Fargo. Fargo does great work with objects. So does Better Call Saul. Better Call Saul has like great object work. Sometimes it's easier to see in a show or a movie because you can watch the object move from person to person. So that's my tip for show don't tell. Okay. All right. We are actually still on time, which is funny because I feel like I'm talking a lot. All right, so we're going to do one more thing, then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and finish up. Coming back to Write or Know Thyself. So I talked a little bit. That's a good question. I think that the reader connecting to an object on their own is always, always better if you can pull it off because the reader feels smart. Because the reader's like, oh, that pen, right? And the reader's like, yes. And so if you tell them, they get it for sure, but they don't have that fantastic moment of like, oh, when it just sort of goes to their heartstrings. So like the way to do that is language, connecting the language to them, and then and people, like connecting people to objects. Those are all really important elements of that. But yeah, if you can get them to make that connection, and like the real trick is getting to them to make them that connection exact right moment, so that you're just like, your job as a writer is to just tug on their heartstrings. You have to be mean. So yeah, that's the best. And you can just sort of, and they often don't even realize it, right? They're just suddenly crying and they're like, I don't really want, and that, it all comes to them. But yeah, like letting the reader discover that is just a glorious moment. Okay, write or know thyself. So I talked a little bit about putter-inner or taker-outer. I started writing as a poet. All my early poems were very short, even for poetry. So it's not really a surprise that I'm a putter-inner. I need to add things. If you're a taker-outer, it means that you figure out what you're writing as you're writing it typically, and so you need to then go back and kind of, it's that kill your darling idea. You kind of don't know who you are until you've written a few things. This is a good reason to just write and finish some things and then see, like, Does this feel deep enough? Does this feel like it's got too much? And those are hard things to learn on your own. So having a critique group, which I'll talk about in a little bit, can be really useful for that too. Are you a plotter or a pantser or something else? These these mean if you're a plotter, you're someone who figures out, like if you're writing a novel or a adventure or any of that stuff, you figure it all out ahead of time. You've got it all designed. You know everything. You know everything that's going to happen to every character. You can tell me exactly how it ends. If you're a pantser, you make it up as you go along. Some other ways to think about this are like if you're going on a road trip and you only know as far as the headlights show, you're a pantser. If you have mapped out exactly where you're going to stay, of all the hotel rooms, you've got 4 maps, and your car is packed with everything you could possibly need, you're a plotter. This is true if you GM as well. I'm also happen to be a pantser as a GM. I just show up and like make stuff up and see what happens and let kind of the process lead me. But plotter GMs are like, okay, I've got all of my NPCs figured out and I know exactly what's going to happen, and they have these beautiful sort of, I'm jealous of them, these sort of beautiful notebooks of like everything that could possibly happen, and they're lovely. And they're both fine. They're both fine ways to write. The question is figuring out what you are, and also sometimes different stories require you or will ask you to be different things. So like sometimes I do plot out a story, but most of the time I'm a pantser. And the reason that that matters is because people who are plotters will tell you that you have to have a plot. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to have a plot, and it turns out I just don't think like that. And so it's just a matter of figuring out how you work so that you don't waste time trying to work someone else's way. And then there are people who are kind of in the middle. They plot a little bit, they pants a little bit, they plot a little bit. If you get out your index cards and you've got the whole wall of sticky notes, you are totally a plotter, and I'm a little bit jealous of that. Okay, then what's your superpower? Here's my story about superpowers. As a writer, it is really hard to know what we're really, really great at. And so I spent a lot of time doing these things that you fill out that are like, get to know your characters, right? And they're like, how tall is your character? What high school does your character go to? What does your character love? Like your main character, your antagonist, your this. And I spent a lot of time when I first was trying to write fiction filling those out, and I couldn't do them. And I really thought that meant that I couldn't be a writer. Because I couldn't these were just simple character sheets. Like all I had to do is fill them out. And so, and then I finally went to a class where someone said, the reason that you can't fill those out is because you do characters instinctively. Characters are what you're good at. You don't need these worksheets. These worksheets are for people who can't do characters. And it was this huge revelation to me that I already had a thing that I knew how to do that I didn't know how to do. So find someone, find a group, find a teacher, find a class, or do the work yourself and figure out what your superpower is so that you don't keep trying to relearn how to do that someone else's way, because everybody has at least one and sometimes more skills that they walk in the door with that they're really great. It could be form, it could be pacing, it could be characters, it could be setting description, it could be maybe you're great at exposition, show don't tell, like it could be anything. And if you don't already know what it is, see if you can find someone who will help you figure that out, because that's your strength, right? You can now sort of use that as your guidepost going forward. Because the next trick is figuring out what your weak spots are. So my weak spot is plot. I am plot, and I have the most antagonistic relationship. You wouldn't believe it. But plot has been so hard for me my whole life. And none of the books that I read about plot helped me. And I realized that's because the people who are writing them are naturally good at plot. And so they can't think the way that I do about plot. And so I had to find my own way to sort of figuring out what that meant. So first step is figuring out what you're not good at. And we'll talk about some ways to do that in a little bit. And then figuring out how to get better. It's like going to the gym, right? If you've already got really strong arms and all you do is work your arms all the time, your legs, which are not as strong, are going to stay and actually get less strong. And so you've got to sort of do this holistic thing to improving your writing. And then what's your favorite part of writing? Like, what is the thing that brings you to the table? What is the thing that excites you about sitting down and making? For some people, it's all the research. They would research forever, and then it's the hard part is sitting down and starting to write. For other people, it's the actual writing. For some people, it's just finishing. Like, I'm done, great. And so knowing what your favorite part is kind of ties into that little bit about doing the words. Because if you can treat yourself by knowing what your favorite part is and giving yourself that as often as possible. Unfortunately for me, my favorite part is starting a project. And so I have learned how to start a project so well, and my least favorite part is finishing a project. And so I have figured out I use all these tricks of rewards and deadlines and all these other things to get through the part that is not my favorite. Okay, talk to me, like, let's do questions until the hour, and then we'll take a 5-minute break. It can be questions about any of the three things that we've talked about. Okay, that all I just looked at the comments and saw, are you going to ride it? And I had no idea what was happening. Yes, I am. Does anybody have questions before we take a quick break? I've thrown a ton of information at you, so it's okay if your head is spinning. Yeah. Dialogue is good. Let's talk about dialogue. I'm waiting for typing. Sorry. Okay. All right, I'm going to talk while these guys are typing. Okay, so let's talk about dialogue. So when you're writing anything, everything that you put on the page needs to do one of three things, and this includes dialogue. Also needs to do this. Those three things are inform the reader, entertain the reader, or move the story forward. And by entertain, I don't mean laugh. I mean intrigue, delight, sad, any sort of emotion. So they need to, so those three things: inform the reader, delight, or somehow other create emotional connection to the reader, and move the story forward. So most scenes, most sentences, most everything do one of those three things. My theory is that dialogue needs to do all three, and it should do all three. And the reason for that is dialogue is such a quick, snappy read that it needs to have a lot of purpose. And so when you're writing dialogue, I think ask yourself, does this give information? Does it give an emotion? And does it move the story forward? Does it progress the story? And like I said, this is true of everything. And it's one of those sort of advanced techniques that, like, when I first started writing, I then had to go back and look at my writing and ask those questions. Now that I've been writing for longer, I do it inherently. If I put something on the page, I'm like, that doesn't have a purpose. I know it right away. So it gets easier with time. But in the beginning, you're probably going to write the thing, and then you need to go back and ask those three questions. And so dialogue needs to show character too. Like, it needs to be like, it's really easy to go over the top of showing character with dialogues and accents and those kinds of things. But I think that showing character in the way in which language is broken is really important. Someone from the East Coast talks differently from someone on the West Coast, even though we have a universal culture that is television and internet and all these things. We still have different words. Like when I moved to the West Coast, I had not heard sack for a grocery bag. I had not heard pop for soda, and I had not heard what's the word for sneakers? There's a word for sneakers that I had not heard. They called tennis shoes. Tennis shoes were the same as sneakers. And so, like, I had this experience as a writer that, like, you could have two people in the same room talking, and if they were from just different coasts within the same country and English was their first language, they still would have these really unique dialogue experiences. And of course, that becomes a microcosm. People talk differently in Seattle than they do in Portland. They have a different cultural reference. They have a different point of view, like all of these things. And so dialogue is really easy to show character with too. I don't know if that answers your question about dialogue. Also, he said, she said is fine, is perfect, is beautiful. And here's why. If you have to say he exclaimed, then it's very likely that the dialogue you've written in the quotation marks doesn't do the exclaiming for you, and it should. So like if you have to say, I don't know, I can't think of something else. Blah 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 blah. He exclaimed. It's not as useful as if you make the blah 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 exclaim, right? So make your language do its own talking, and then you can use he said, she said, all those kinds of things all the time. Okay, let me see. What are the questions? Everyone's head is spinning. How much time do I devote to research? That's a good question. It depends on the project. Some projects, like when I wrote Predation, the dinosaur time travel game, I did a ton of research for that one because I wanted the dinosaurs and the time travel and the far future stuff to all be very realistic. And so I tend to immerse myself and kind of magpie. So like I jump into all these things and I steal things that I think are cool. Like, oh, this is a cool idea. Oh, look, they made a spacesuit out of this material that also, lights on fire. And so I just sort of start stealing ideas from everywhere, and they kind of coalesce by the time I'm ready to write. Um, I think like the real truth is I just like making shit up, but sometimes research is necessary for me. Whereas other people like really like researching, and the making stuff up is not as fun for them. So I think it depends on the project, and it depends on how excited I am. Like I'm really excited about dinosaurs and time travel and far future stuff, and so I spent more time researching than I would have for something that's definitely not in my interests. Then it just becomes kind of part of the work. Improv that doesn't seem like improv, seamlessly weaving the pantser into the planner. Um, I don't think. Can you ask Alex? Can you ask that question? If that's a question, can you ask it in a different way? Because I don't think I understand it. Thank you. And then, is it okay to have things in your story that are just for fun flavor? Yes, except that they're also doing work. And so here's what I mean by this. Like, if you have if you put mushrooms just as a random thing for fun flavor into the beginning of your story, let's say you're setting it on another world and you have mushrooms and they're cool. Mushrooms are cool, right? There's lots going on with mushrooms. And then you start thinking about what mushrooms are thematically and how they operate and how they work, then suddenly you have a theme that you could incorporate. And so I know it was just the first thing that came to my mind. And so like yes, you can, but more often than not, they will become important. And it's actually one of my favorite parts of writing is I'm just writing along and something appears to me. I'm like, oh, I'm going to put this kind of flower over here and see what happens, or whatever the thing is. And then when I get towards the end of the story, I'm like, oh, what would be really great here? Like a comment about honey. And then suddenly that flower that came in earlier gets tied into a bee, and it has a meaning that threads through the whole thing. So I think that as it's that idea of putting things in there that we don't even realize. We're all smarter than we think. And so I think even the things that we're putting in there for fun end up having these really cool connotations because it's just your subconscious doing its work. Stephen King calls them the boys in the basement. And I think that like my people in the basement are pretty awesome and they do a lot of work for me. And particularly if it's a thing I'm kind of geeking on anyway, then I can find a way to use it and bring it back. So yeah, I think totally, I think you can totally have those things, but I think they actually have deeper meaning than you think that they do. And then, okay, so I want to go back to Alex's question. When you plan stuff and your players say something interesting, I still feel like it's, oh, right. So, if you're a planner, and let's just talk about running a game for a second, because I'm assuming like a bunch of you are gamers. If you're a planner and you suddenly go off the rails, right? I would imagine, not being a planner, but I would imagine that is a hard space because I've had GMs sort of try to herd me back into their plan. And so how do you let them do their thing while still feeling like you're on plan? And I would say both in writing and GMing, it's a matter of trusting yourself because you have this goal, you have this plan, and yes, things have gone awry, but trusting yourself that by doing all this work, you will get it back to the place where you think you want it or where it's going to be awesome or where the plan eventually will go is really the way to do it. So like, at least for me. So I find that if I just, if you've laid down all the groundwork and that means that you're going to eventually get there, even if it's a little bit, the route is different than you expected. And so I think just trusting your own brain to let that happen is the way to go. Although it can be a little bit hard to let go of that, I think. Okay, I have talked for an hour, so we're going to take a 5-minute break. And we're going to talk, when we come back, we're going to talk about my top 5 fiction tips, a few of which we've touched on, and then we're going to talk about polish and publish, which are sort of the two NPs very briefly. And then I'm going to open it up to questions for you guys for like the last half an hour or so. And you can ask anything. It doesn't have to be something that we've talked about. It can be anything about fiction or fiction writing or game writing or kind of whatever interests you. So I will see you at 10 after. I'm just going to mute so you don't have to listen to me playing with the dog.
Everybody, and we will be back at minutes after the hour.
All right, this is the best chat ever, you guys. I'm so glad that you're. I was going to suggest starting a Twitter writers group. I love it. Makes me happy. You guys could also start a Slack. Our writers group uses Slack. And it's awesome. For those of you guys who are working on game stuff, actually, this is for everyone, but I had another book to recommend, Video Game Storytelling. I know it's got the video game in the title, but it's actually just a really great look at storytelling in general. I will also add it to the list. All right, I'm gonna let you guys keep chatting as I get started. All right, so let's see if I can squeeze this into 20 minutes so that we have lots of questioning time. And we'll see how we do that. All right, so top five fiction tips. These are the things that I wish someone had told me when I started writing. Particularly fiction, although some of them pertain to setting and game design as well. The first one for fiction is, what does your character want? And then, what do they really want? And why can't they have it? For me, all fiction is based about this idea. And so the first answer is, what does your character want? They want to be happy. They want to be in love, right? They want to be this, they want to be that. But that's the external projection of what they want, right? This is the sort of first response that we all give to strangers. How are you? Oh, I'm fine, right? But then the question for you to ask as a writer is, what do they really want? Deep down in their hidden heart of hearts, the place that they never show anyone, what do they really, really want? Because this is the thing that drives your story. And then why can't they have it? Is the part that creates conflict and tension. And because if a person was like, oh, I want this, and then they got it, it's not really a story. So the reason that they can't have it needs to be as strong as their desire to have it. So when you think about story, start thinking about it that way. This character wants something so, so badly, and they can't have it because the person or the thing that's opposing them is opposing them just as hard. I mean, really, all you have to do is read the news these days, and you will see stories just like this everywhere. Right? People who are super passionate about a thing, who really want a thing so deeply in their heart, and someone with more power and more resources is saying no, or something like a hurricane or some other event, force, super evil character, whatever it is, with more power, more help sometimes, more money, whatever that thing is saying no. And so we see the sort of everyman against this power, and that is where story comes from. That's where conflict comes from. That thing in our inner hearts that we want so badly, and someone is telling us we can't have it. And again, I'm using someone sort of, it's not always someone, right? I'm glad. That is, and sometimes people say like stories are things that happen to people, but I don't think that's true. I think that stories are people happening to people, right? And both ways. And then tied into that is, what does your character do? Because the most boring story in the world often is a character who does nothing, a character to whom everything happens. And the reason that that's boring is because we want them to fight for what they love. And sometimes they don't, and that is a heartbreaker of a story, right? You've seen those, you've read those, and you're just like, no, get up, do something, right? That's that thing we yearn for, is for the everyman to like be better than we are, to like stand up and do the thing. And so what does your character do is a really important part. And I say this as someone whose early stories showed their characters walking around a lot and things happening to them. So this was one of the things that I really had to learn, was like, oh, my character has to act. They can't just walk around with this thing buried in their heart and like really, really desire it forever. They actually have to act to get it. And so if you read your story or you're working on a story, you're saying, what is my character doing? What is the thing that they're taking action for toward their goal of wanting what they can't have? Empathy. There are some really fantastic, there's some fantastic writers of craft who make perfectly crafted stories that you don't give a shit about. And my theory is that the reason for this is because there's no empathy. They don't ask what their characters want. They don't ask why they can't have it. They don't ask what their readers want. And it's just a skill that they may not have. So like there are books that are out there that you may or may not have read that are just perfect. Like they've got pacing and tension and all this other stuff, but you just sort of feel flat when you read them. And I think that empathy is a really important part of that. You can get really far, and I say this as someone who knows, on empathy, even if you don't know how to do things like plot, because your readers will care so much that they won't notice the holes that you have left in your skill set. So I think empathy. What does my character want? What does my reader need? This is particularly true if you're writing like game design stuff. What does my reader, what does my player, what does my GM need to know? And when do they need to know it are hugely important. It's a little tricky to talk about thinking about your reader as a writer, because on one hand, you don't know who that person will be. On the other, it can be kind of stressful. I find it really stressful to think, oh, somebody's going to read this. It's like, oh. And that sort of shuts me down a little bit. But the truth is that I need to give them what they need. And we talked before about those moments where like the reader discovers the thing you want them to discover and how awesome that is. That's part of thinking about the reader. I assume my readers are smart and I assume my readers love the discovery of reading. And so, not everyone is going to love the stuff that I write. But my goal is to make the kind of readers that I want to read my work love what I write. And so I think having empathy for the reader, having empathy for your characters, this is huge. You don't have to make your characters empathetic. You don't have to make likable characters even. But if you understand why they're such horrors, you can create even totally unlikable characters and people won't be able to stop reading with them. I mean, if you can make your character, or if you can make your reader care about your horrible, horrible villain, just like a little bit, that's a pretty interesting challenge. I really like that. I like that moment where you've got this horrible, horrible person and you understand why they're so broken. And I think that's a really delightful thing. Beginnings and endings. We've talked a little bit about these. Beginnings are typically easier for people, for many people. And this is because there's all this energy. You may not know where you're going, but you feel really solid and good. Endings are often harder. For plotters, the opposite is sometimes true because they know where they want to end up and they don't know how to start. And so each person will have a different thing. We won't talk about middles because middles are just horrible for everybody. It's just the truth of writing. So beginnings, like I said, don't start boring. Don't have your dude wake up and have a regular old breakfast and go off to work unless there's some super amazing, cool, interesting tension there. This is true even if it's set on like Mars. Right? People, like if the waking up and the breakfast and all that stuff is still the same without any tension, like the difference between somebody waking up on Mars and having breakfast of some kind and going to work, the difference between that and someone waking up on Mars who like is worried about that thing that they've got in the back of their head that may just be an illness, or it might be maybe somebody implanted something, or and they can hear it every time they chew their cereal and they keep touching it. Like that's the difference right there between a boring story and a not boring story. People can be doing the same thing, but you have this underlying tension. You have this question that you're threading through. What is that thing in the back of his neck? Why didn't he get it looked at? Is it some kind of Martian thing, right? Is it going to bother him? Is it really just this giant bug? So if your reader is starting to ask questions, I can't stop touching the back of my neck now. If your reader is starting to ask questions, you've got it. You've got it. And so that's where I say, like, listen to the rules, but then break them if you can. All right, so beginnings, you have to give a lot of information to your reader, and you have to give it to them in a way that is not boring. So this is tricky, and I think the way to do that is by setting them concretely in a place with your characters. If you are talking sort of in your head, it's really easy to lose a reader out of the gate. So have your characters do something, engage in something, have a stress, have a worry, like all this stuff is a really good place to start. Have a ticking time bomb that you put at the put it in the first sentence if you can, put in the first paragraph, that you just feel like there's a sudden thing that's going to go off eventually. And this is the way to start creating tension, because you've got this, you're starting to thread, starting to foreshadow, which is a really, really So the way to make a great ending is when the reader gets there, and think about experiences you've had like this. You get there, and the ending's a surprise, and yet you're like, oh, of course. Right? There's moments where like it surprises you, and yet you go, oh, but of course there was no other ending. And so those are beautiful. And the way you do that is by foreshadowing. And again, it comes back to that idea of objects, where the reader is catching all these little glimpses of what you're trying to say, and then they all come together at the end. I saw a comment. Started media rise. Oh, yeah. Flashbacks. Flashbacks are. I'm not a fan of flashbacks, even though I had to use them a few times. Flashbacks are really hard because you have to make the flashback as interesting as the current story. And I know very few writers who can do that. I think flashbacks. I'm gonna postulate that flashbacks are sometimes a sign of a weakness in a writer's not being able to find a better way to give that information. But that's not always true, right? Don't take my word for that 100%. But I feel often flashbacks are used that way, and you have to sit through this sort of boring flashback that sometimes you already know, and you're just like, why did you make me go through this? So think about flashbacks, whether or not you really want to use them, because they can be really tricky to write well. But oh man, I say that, but I often use them. Flashbacks are like a whole nother writing class. All right, we won't go into those too much. All right, so your ending. So your goal is to make it so that it came as a surprise, yet it's inevitable. And the way to do that is foreshadowing. You show think about how early we see. I'm going to use Lord of the Rings because it's something most people see. How early you see the ring on fire in that book or in that movie to sort of forecast the ending. And you don't know what that means, right? It's really, really early, but it comes full circle, and so you're like, of course, eventually that ring was going to burn because we saw it with fire early on, and so you're giving your reader these hints. Hi, Pop. How do you know how much reader the information needs? Yeah, that's a really good question. If the reader there's a difference between what the hell is going on and oh, what the hell is going on, and so that's for me the line where I'm frustrated. Like there's a line where I'm like, I don't know what is going on, and I am so frustrated by this. Versus, I don't know what's going on, but I trust the reader to tell me. And I think that the way you learn that is by stealing how other people do it. So, like if you read a book that does it really, really well, and this is true for any topic in writing, like break it apart, figure out how they did. How did they make it so that I had a question, but it wasn't an angry question. It was I can't wait to find this out question. Because they're like not having enough information and not pointing your reader, like they'll start guessing. They'll start like if you don't tell your reader where you want them to look, they'll start pulling on all the threads, and they're like, well, it could be the fish, or it could be the microphone, or it could be this, or it could be this, and then their brains just start doing what we call headcanon, where they're like, I know the answer to all these things, or they're like, I don't know, I'm overwhelmed. So I think it's kind of an intuitive thing that you learn over time, but I think you can also steal from lots of people. Not steal, but figure out how they do it, and then take that skill for yourself. Okay, so beginnings and endings, and then titles. I want to talk about titles because nobody ever talks about titles. My passion about titles comes from being a poet, where if you've got a 20-line poem, your title is line 21, and it's really important. It's very weighty. It matters. Your title is a contract to your reader. It says, here is what this is about, or it says, here is how this is going to make you feel, or it says, here is this sort of essence of this lyricism, or it says, you know what? It's none of those things. Figure it out for yourself. Sherman Alexie has a poem, I think it's called This Is Not About My Father. And just in a poem like that, you're suddenly like, oh, but is it? And of course, as you read it, of course it is, right? So anytime, so think about your titles. Titles also go through sort of marketing streaks. Like one-word titles were really popular, and then name titles were popular. And then for a while, we had these really long, 40-word titles, which I kind of liked, except you could never talk about the book because you'd be like, that one's got the ship and the diver and the something in the title. And so think about your title and what it gives to your reader to enhance the text. And so it's tricky because you don't want to tell, you don't want to be you don't want to tell like the ending or something with your title, right? But you want to make them a promise. And so decide what kind of handshake are you giving them. Um, there's a there just looking at titles is just such a fun exercise, and seeing like, does this appeal to me? Why does this appeal to me? And then if you read the book, figure out, does the book give you what the title promised? A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet is one of the long titles that has come out in the last couple of years, and it's an interesting juxtaposition between that title and the book itself. And it's one of those ones that works because it's in disharmony, and I think that's really interesting. So think about your title a lot. Make sure that and the hard part about titles is that your publisher, if you get published, is going to want to change it anyway. But if you're like, here's why this title is the right title, they are much more likely to work with you. All right, polish and publish, and then we'll do questions. Know when to stop. So you're working on a draft, you've been working on a draft forever, you've been working on a draft for 20 years, this is your novel, be done. Like, there's a point where you are just trying to make it perfect, and you can't make it perfect in the first draft. And so letting it go is one of the hardest things that you can learn as a writer. It's just saying, okay, this is as perfect as this draft is going to get. I need to let it go. I recommend putting it away for a while. I think it's really useful because you come back, and the best part is you're like, oh, this part's really freaking good. Holy crap, I wrote this. And it's like this moment of joy. It's just lovely. And so I recommend putting things away for that reason, but also because you can also sort of start to see your flaws. You become less sort of emotionally attached. I've heard parents who are also writers equate writing things to sort of giving birth. Right? You create this thing, and then you put it out into the world. And like, when you put it out into the world too soon, it's still your baby, and you're still very like protective of it, and so you can't really see it for its own self. It's still attached to part of you, and so if you can put it away for a while, I think that's useful. Which leads us to getting feedback. You guys are going to start a writers group. I think this is awesome. I have a writers group that I love. I've had writers group my whole life. Some of them have been better than others. The key to getting feedback is knowing how much feedback you can take, because too much feedback, even if it's great feedback, can really just break you. It can just break your heart, and it will keep you from writing for a long time. Every writer that I've talked to, most writers that I've talked to, have had that experience in their life. They had a bad class, they had a bad critique group, they gave it to their partner who just tore it apart. And like that lasts, right? That is not a fun thing to recover from. So like, know what your armor status is before you put a thing in the world. Like, here's an example for me. Like, when I give things to people that I really care about and respect, it's so much harder and scarier than when I give it to a stranger, because I want the people that I know and respect to think I'm a good writer. And so like, sort of figuring out this kind of stuff. The other way to get really good feedback and know your armor is to say, here's how much feedback I can take, or this is the kind of feedback that I would like. And one of the really valid things to hear is, I just want to know what's working. And if you can find someone who can give you that, that is a fantastic thing, because particularly as you're just starting to get feedback and learning sort of your superpower, it's really great to focus on this, because you can then see it starts to elevate the stuff that is working out of the stuff that isn't. And I think that's really helpful. Revising is a whole thing on itself. I kind of just put it on here because I thought you guys might have questions and I wanted to mention it. I think a lot of what happens for particularly beginning writers, if they're revising, is they start going back and revising like word by word. And there's two kinds of revision. One is that word by word revision, which actually happens much later. And then there's what I would call re-envisioning, where you put your story away for a while, you come back, you step back, and you re-envision the thing that you're creating as a whole. This isn't line work. This isn't looking at like small changes. This is like big time. Is this story what I want it to be? Is it working? All those kinds of things. Man, I realized we just skipped half the craft basics in my list, so sorry about that. I don't know how that happened. Okay, so for revising, there's re-envision and there's revising, and they're very different, and they're kind of a skill that you learn by doing them. Submitting publishing contracts, we could talk about all these things if you guys want to. They are sort of next step. I have a lot of information about them. I don't know how useful that is to most people because it sounds like you guys are still in the like, how do I make the thing space. So I'm going to have like 2 minutes before I want to open it to questions. I'm going to jump up to craft basics, which I think I skipped some of. Read, but just don't read. This ties into that idea of like breaking things apart. So every time you read a thing and you think, man, that was really well done, how did they do that? Find the answer, pull it apart. Even if you don't find the answer, just pulling it apart is really useful to developing your own skills. We talked a little bit, very briefly, about characters because character motivation, what they want, what they really want, what they can't have, drives your story. It doesn't matter what hair color your character has, unless that's somehow part of their like super inner like change their life status. It doesn't matter how tall they are. It doesn't matter what they wear. Those are interesting, and they can tie into other things, right? Because if you say someone is wearing like a dress that's a brand name label, that tells you a great deal about the character, versus someone who's dressed in sweatpants and has paint stains all over their shirt. Both of those things tell totally different tales about a character versus someone who's got like a totally geeky t-shirt and like rainbow suspenders, and like those things matter. They teach us, and it goes back to objects. It teaches a lot about the character. Descriptions, we talked a little bit about this in other topics. Form and length. So forms in order of short to long are microfiction, which also has some other names like flash fiction. These are like anywhere from 10 words to 500 words. Poetry, which obviously goes all over the board. Short stories, which are typically 2,500 to tops like 8 or 10,000 words. 5,000 words is kind of the average for short stories. Then you have novelettes and novellas, which are both longer, and the word count for these is kind of all over the board, somewhere between 10 and 30. Novels these days are getting longer and longer. You're getting 90,000 words minimum, up. So that's sort of form and length. We talk, game design. That is just all over the board. And my theory is always that a story will tell you how long it needs to be. And this is true of like, I think of RPG stuff as well. Like you start to get a sense of how long a thing should be. And that just comes with practice and time, or someone else coming in and helping you and being like, this feels like it's just sort of this much too long. And here's the place that is true. All right, I see some thoughts on publishing. Okay. Let's do this. Last half hour, we'll do questions. I can't promise we'll get to them all because you guys have like tons of really good questions and you drop them in really fast, but I'm going to try and include publishing and contracts and those kinds of things in there, and we'll talk about all of it. I know it's a little bit all over the board tonight, you guys, but I wanted to pack a lot of information in. So questions will get even more wiggy in terms of that. Self-publishing versus the big five. Okay, that's a good question. That's changing rapidly. The big five are typically hardest to get into, particularly for beginning writers. Kickstarter and Patreon have changed self-publishing sort of deeply. There are people who make tons and tons of money on self-publishing. I think it's a great way to go if you know how to get an audience. You hire an editor, or find an editor. You find someone to do all the layout and stuff for you, or you know how to do it yourself. And you're willing to spend a lot of your writing time marketing, or you hire someone to do that, because unless you already have a big following, it's really hard to grow. Like, this is what publishers are supposed to give you, is promotion, connections, getting you in front of people, getting you in the bookstores. That's all changing really fast. Kindle and all the other e-readers, things online. There's a lot of sort of middle publishers who are small enough, they really take care of their authors, and they give you great publicity, and they push you out in front of everybody. And so, a lot of it just depends on what you want to do. If you just want to write, you don't want to worry about like all of that stuff, all the marketing and the editing and stuff. Like, having a publisher do that part of it is great. And size and stuff like that depends on your skill set, but also on, do you want a really personal touch and you're going to be hand sold to less people, or do you want to kind of possibly get lost in one of the sort of big fives? I've done all of the things that I am talking about, and they're all very different. And for me, the truth is, I really like to write the thing and then not have to deal with it. And I've had the best luck with middle-sized publishers. They take good care of me. They do great editing jobs. They put my book at the tops of their list. And so even though it's not as big of a list as a bigger publisher, they work harder, I think. And that's just been my experience. How do you build elements of mystery into your different types of writing? Do you mean, Frank? Do you mean mystery like like mystery genre, or do you mean mystery like questions that the readers have? Ugh. Okay, so pacing things. This goes back to sort of empathy for the reader and assuming that they're smart. My goal is to have them figure it out right before the character figures a thing out. And so I reveal a thing to them just before I reveal it to the character. That's kind of confusing because I want them to be. The character can't be too dumb and can't like figure out the reveal too late, but the reader needs to figure it out just ahead of them. Okay, good. I'm glad you get that. And sometimes that never happens in the first draft. In the first draft, I can't figure out where I'm revealing anything, and I like move things around. I'm like, okay, they know this here. No, wait, no, that's too slow. No, she looks dumb because I've revealed this thing 3 times, and the main character still doesn't get it. And so I think that's my goal is have the reader figure it out just before the character does. Do you guys have more questions? I will say that I'm going to do Charles's job for a second while we're waiting for typing. This will be available so you can rewatch it. I will update the outline, I'm sorry, the resource list too, so you can have the new one. All right.
I'll just jump in and add that we'll take the video and clean it up just a little bit. So that might take us a couple of days. Actual availability of the video might not be like 5 minutes after the seminar ends, but we'll let everybody know within a few days.
Cool. Thank you. I like the name of that, Darcy. Nice. All right. So how do you cope with middles? Middles are the hardest part of writing for so many people. And the reason is because they tend to get saggy and they tend to kind of like the pace slows down. And it's because people have a hard time, and I include myself in this, figuring out how to do tension. So there's a couple of ways to do tension. Like let's say a novel. Let's say we're working on a novel, just because that's got a good long, right? So you've got the beginning, and you set up all these mysteries, and then you have the end, and you sort of answer all the mysteries, sort of generally speaking. And then you have this middle, and you're like, yeah, but what happens here? And particularly for me, who started writing very short fiction and then moved into novel writing, I was like, why does it need a middle? Why can't I just go from here to here? But then, of course, it's a short story, and so I figured that out. So the middle, there's a couple ways to do middle that doesn't get boring. One is to add new points of tension. And so if you've got, like, let's say, I don't want to get too deep, so I'm going to try to keep it. So like you've got your main character and their arc is happening here. And so their tension like relieves itself for a moment. You think, okay, they've got this all solved. But then you give them, or if you have a second point of view or a second character, you give them an arc that at that point is just like, oh no, what's going to happen? And so you can create this sort of woven space that helps the middle from just sort of sagging. I'm a fan of like ratcheting tension with breaks in between. And so what happens is I think that sorry, this is hard to talk about. I think that the answer is ask more questions at the beginning than you think you need to, and create more hurdles than you think you need to, because those hurdles and those questions are going to fill your middle. And so like typically, at least I start and I have one main question that I'm trying to answer. And then by I get to the middle, it's either answered or it can't be answered until here, and then I don't know what to put in there. So I think by seeding your beginning with lots more questions and lots more stress points. And so if we talk about it in terms of what does your character want, what does your character really want, and why can't they have it, there could be multiple answers to these questions and multiple reasons that they can't have it. Or there could be one answer to this question and multiple reasons why they can't have it. And ideally, those multiple reasons are tied together. So Let's come up with an example. So this character feels like she's never going to be loved. She feels like she's going to be alone her whole life. And the reason that she feels like that is because her whole life has told her that that is true. I'm going kind of literary side. And so as part of this, she finds a partner. Let's say she finds a partner. And so she's starting to like, and it's working really well. And like, all of the things are good, and she's getting what she wants finally. And her mother is this antagonist, but then her mother sort of softens. And so that's when you get this middle. But if it turns out that the person that she's dating actually is dating her for some other reason and isn't actually fulfilling her, then you've got a middle that's suddenly cool and interesting and tension. And the ending is going to be, of course, that she's going to feel loved, whether it's by herself or for someone else. And the thing that you thought was resolving it is actually a second problem. I don't know if that made sense. I hope so. I don't know where. Sometimes coming up with an example is the hardest part. But you could do that with sci-fi or fantasy too. You think the problem isn't really the problem, and the problem is actually bigger, and that helps the tension. That helps the middle kind of kick its way through. All right, I have to scroll back, you guys. Sorry, I talked too long. Building tension between more action type scenes. Yes, characters. Create characters who are on parallel tracks, like who want the same thing, but only one of them gets it, right? And so even if they don't know that, like you as the reader are thinking, oh no, they don't know they're competing for the same thing. They're friends, and they're going to get to the end of this, and they're going to go, oh no, there's only one of these, and we both won, and we both worked so hard for it. So building tension in your reader, even if the characters don't know there's tension is a great way to make your reader feel engaged and enticed. You can also make like non-action scenes. The tension typically comes between characters. One great way to create tension is to have a character say one thing and think something entirely different. Right? There's a tension there, no matter what they're saying. If it's different than what they're thinking, you are instantly intrigued. You're like, why are they saying this thing when that's clearly not what they believe, or that's clearly not what they want, or that's clearly not what they want to say? And so that interior-exterior tension, which we do all the time as human beings, is a really great way to sort of create a dialogue that's interesting and full of tension. How can you use your knowledge of characters and the fictional world to help you find good ideas on actual story ideas? Sorry, Andrea, I'm not sure how to say that. Can you try that question again? I'm not sure I understand it. I'm sorry. I'm gonna keep. How do you describe a character without doing the look in the mirror scene? That's such a great question. I think that character description is less important than people make it out to be, but also the way that I would, so you can do it a ton of different ways. If you've got different point of view characters, obviously having another point of view talk about that character is great. I tend to do it by change. And so like I would do it by a character taking an action that is different and changes their appearance. So like, a perfect example would be like she had overslept, and so she couldn't get her contacts in. So she was going to have to wear her really thick lenses, which made her eyes look darker than normal or something like that, right? So like she's doing an action because she knows what she looks like. And so, you can have the character talk about their own appearance in terms of their emotional space. If you can connect appearance to emotion, that's always the best way to go. And so like even like, talking about a piece of clothing fitting or not fitting, like it's too tight or it's too loose, or like, this was my husband's, but I wear it because it smells like him. Like these are character descriptions that allow us to see the character without having to look in the mirror, but also with creating an emotional impact. And so the key, in my opinion, is to pick a very specific part of a character that matters and tying that specific part to an emotional description. And so like, for example, to go back to the contacts glasses thing, if you're writing a story about a character's inability to see the world clearly for whatever reason, because she lies to herself, because she's in a daydream, because she's, whatever this thing is, and you describe her using something like contacts and glasses, now your character description is emotional, it's tied to your theme, it's tied to her inner world, and you've done all of this amazing work with just one character description. And so I encourage you to think about, when you describe the character, pick a thing that matters. Teeth are sensitive. People are sensitive about their mouths and their teeth, fingers. Like, what are you describing and why? Because it can do so much heavy lifting for you. All right, scrolling. They look in a puddle. That's fine. Okay, publishing, specific conferences and conventions. The best convention I've ever been to for writers is Confusion. It's in the spring, I think, early part of the year. It's so small and so lovely and so welcoming. I highly recommend it if you can get there. They don't have coffee on site. That's my only complaint. So if you need coffee, take it with you. But it's a fantastic small convention. Gen Con does a writer symposium. It's big. It can be a little overwhelming, but it's a great place to meet people if you go to panels and stuff like that. I have never had an agent. I've heard lots of people talk about them. I think they have a lot of benefits and a lot of negatives. I'm probably not a super good person to talk about that stuff because, like I said, I've never had an agent. I've never tried to get one. I tend to take sort of the back route to things that I want. But I would say that the business side, like, if you can find a mentor, I think that's a great way to do it. Like, if you can find someone who's done the process and is willing to kind of walk you through it. And, sometimes that's an exchange, like they need someone to be a first reader in exchange, or sometimes people do that for a living. So if you can find someone to sort of walk you through that process, I think it's a lot easier. But the thing is even if you make a mistake, it's not the end of the world. Like, if you submit and it turns out like you did something wrong, like that, that's totally part of being starting to submit. I would say start small. I started small by submitting to online publications because they had really clear guidelines. They told me when they would get back to me. They told me how to submit. I didn't have to go through an agent. So that's how I started. If you're doing books, I think it's harder. There are fewer publications that will take submissions. I think it's Apex that does a thing every year where they take novel submissions for people who don't have agents. I think it ends in February, and that's a fantastic way to start doing that. There's a few other companies out there. Angry Robot does one of those as well, where you can send them your book, completed book, and you don't need an agent or anything. So I would look for those too if you have a full book. All right, I'm going to plow through the last few. Suggestions for ending a scene that's low on tension. All right, so scenes. So if you're trying to end your scene, ask yourself, where did the scene start emotionally, and is it ending on a different place? And so if your characters start and they're in a fight, and they end and they're like laughing and talking and they've returned to friendships, your scene is done. But if they started and they're just hanging out and talking, and they're still hanging out and talking by the end of the scene is not doing the work yet that it should be doing, probably. So something needs to change in a scene in order to make it a scene. And usually that's an emotional crux. And it could be just one friend. Like, if there's 3 friends and they're all hanging out and laughing, and by the end just one friend feels ousted or feels like it's not part of the group or feels unwelcome or feels uncomfortable, like then you have a scene. And so, like, end the scene when the emotional change happens. Sometimes it's also a change of venue. You'll notice scenes ended, but there's also usually an emotional scene, emotional change. So if the emotion is different from the beginning to the end, then you know to end it. If it hasn't changed, you kind of have to keep writing until you figure out what the change is, and then go back and cut, is my suggestion for that. Typical limit to canon bruising. I don't know what that is. Oh, canon bruising. Oh, yes, I do. Sorry, I was thinking very literal. I think, yeah. I mean, I think, someone who has some really good insights on that question is Erin Evans, and she's written some really fantastic blog posts. She wrote heavily for the D&D line and talks a lot about just having to break canon and explain why. And it made a lot of readers love her. It made some readers really angry at her. But I would go and look at her insights. It's Erin Evans. She's written she wrote a ton of books for D&D, and is sort of notorious for just kind of screwing around with canon and getting away with it. And so I think that she would be a really, really interesting resource for that. And I think here's what I think. I think as a writer, if you can say it with enough authority, you can get away with it. That's my that's my sort of end all be all. If I can say it with enough authority and put it on the page and make my reader believe it, I can get away with anything. Don't tell anyone I said. All right. Is it hurtful to spread your writing in lots of venues? It wasn't for me. Caveat, some people find that to be, some people have been told that that's a bad thing, and so they do pen names. Pen names are the kind of thing where it's really, I think it's a very personal choice. Do you have things that you want to protect? Like I started in the erotica world, and so like a lot of the people that I wrote with had pen names because they had children or they had a very conservative family or they had these choices to make about pen names. We asked that when I came out with a kids game, is it bad that I'm an erotica writer and write a kids game? And the answer we decided was no, because one sort of leads to the other sometimes. And so I think it's not hurtful to work in lots of different careers. It's much more. So it used to be really common, like people would write in all kinds of careers, in all kinds of fields. And then there was a thing where you couldn't do that, and everyone started doing pen names. It's becoming common again. Delilah Dawson, Chuck Wendig, like that whole crowd of people who do games and comics and short stories and novels and all kinds of genres. I think it's becoming more and more common, and I don't think it's hurtful in any way. Again, just my opinion. Somebody else has probably had a different opinion or a different experience. How long should an ending be? Endings tend to be shorter. And in fact, when you're writing books, it feels weird because you spend all this time and then suddenly your ending's like going really fast and you're like, wait, I'm doing something wrong. But endings just sort of naturally are shorter. My endings tend to be about I would say like a tenth of the rest of the book. And that's just a guess. I mean, I don't think that's a official answer from anyone, but they tend to be short. And it depends on the kind of ending, but you could also sometimes they're longer because they have a denouement. They have like a moment of breathing after that. We just went and saw Black Panther, and I won't give away any spoilers, but typically in action movies are a great thing to take apart because they're they're so regimented in their action sequences. And so if you go and watch any of the Marvel action movies, you will see that there's the big battle. And then you can see, if you time it, you can see exactly from the big battle to the end how long. And then they often have a denouement, like a very short, where everybody's happy and or whatever. And so you can kind of see exactly how long those endings are, and that's sort of typical. I think different books need different length endings. Sometimes you need more breathing space. Sometimes you don't. But generally speaking, they tend to be pretty quick. Okay. So I'm so behind. So you wrote or thought about a fictional world, missing ideas, and how to make a cool story. Okay, so that's a great thing because here for me is the difference between game writing and fiction writing. Game writing is actually weirdly like my forte because it's all characters and world building, and then in fiction writing it's like plot, right? And so suddenly I have to think about it differently. So to answer the question about take a world building, cool characters and backstories. How to make a cool story. I would say take those cool characters with their cool backstories and figure out which one has the most interesting story and say, okay, you've got the most interesting story. And now based on the backstory or whatever, ask those questions of your characters. What do you want? No, what do you really want? And then say, why can't you have it? And the answer of why can't you have it is going to be in your world building, right? You've got somewhere in the world building, you have an automaton, you have a dude, you have a world-crushing storm of some kind coming, you have whatever it is, somewhere in your world building, you've made the answer to the questions. And then once you do that, you've already started, you've got a really cool story, and you've got all the work done. And so now it's just a matter of pulling out the pieces that go with that character and that story and that background. Of course, you can do multiple point of views. I think multiple point of views are harder because you have more to keep track of and more desires and more antagonists. And so I started out doing almost everything in a single point of view because it's just easier for me to wrap my head around. Right, and Lord of the Rings, let's think about this, came from a group of people who were friends who were given a mission right? And didn't want the mission. They wanted to wanted to stay home and do their thing. But the world was at stake. And so like making your world at stake is a great way to get your character out the door because that's the world they live in. That's the world that like affects them and that they want to, you know, raise kids in or do whatever they want to do in it. And so I think that that totally works. Is it wise to skip around when starting a, okay, so just skip around when starting a story or should you plow all the way through it? I think that this depends a little bit on if you're a pantser or a plotter. Those are getting harder to say. I also think that, you know, everyone is different. I skip all over the place because I'm a pantser. I'm like, you know what? I have a cool idea for a scene. I'm going to figure out how it fits into this story later. And so I will go and write this cool idea for a scene. And often I won't actually understand the purpose of the scene until I start fitting it back into the rest of the story. And then I'm like, oh, wait, this goes here and it leads to this. So I think however you can get words on the page is how you should get words on the page. And so if you're like, I must know exactly what sentence came before this before I can write the next sentence, do that. And if you're like, no, this is boring, I don't know what I'm going to say here, I'm going to skip to this part, do that. Like I think that when it comes to writing, if you're getting words on the page, there is really just no wrong answer. I do skip all over the place. It's just a disaster. It really is, but it works. So I'm not gonna I'm not gonna stop doing it. Um, let's see. Oh, you just talked about POV. I do think I think single POV is easier to start with for me because I only had to concentrate on one single goal, one single antagonist, one single story thread. But I know that other people find POV easier because of that middle thing we were talking about. Having lots of POVs allows you to have every character at a different point in their progression, and so the middle doesn't sort of start to get boring. So I think it depends on how much you can hold in your head. And that was like coming from poetry. Like when I first started, this was how much I could hold in my head, like 6 lines. And then I started working on fiction and I was like, all right, short stories, I can hold this much in my head. And now with a novel, I can kind of hold this much in my head. But like sagas or, you know, those POV stories that also go through giant tons of time, like that is just beyond me. I just can't keep track of everyone's story and kind of don't have any interest. That's not really why I write. Goes back to that, like, what do you love about writing? And for me, keeping track of like, well, this POV and this POV and these people's, I just like, nope. But for some people, that's a real passion. So I think if you feel overwhelmed moving out of a single POV, stick with single POV for a while until you get it. If single POV feels boring and it doesn't work for the story you're trying to tell, try a second one and kind of see how you feel with that. I think different stories also need different levels of point of view. Like I said before, some stories are a personal growth story and they only really need one point of view, and some are bigger than that. Okay, we're almost on time. Let's see, one more question. Follow up on POV. How do you show the emotional state of other characters when you have a single POV? Dialogue, yeah. So this is great because remember earlier I was saying for your POV character, you could have them say one thing and actually be thinking another. And so if I'm the POV character and I'm looking at another character and they're telling me one thing, they're like, oh, you know, I'm not too worried about that. But the way they're saying it is, oh, you know, I'm not too worried about that. And they're sort of jittery in their body. Then my main character is smart enough to go, huh, that's really weird. And so I can do a lot. I can do a lot with body language. I mean, we're picking up micro expressions all the time as human beings. And so describing those micro expressions of the other person like says a lot. The other thing that you can do is, again, I'm such a huge fan of objects, right? So like, let's say someone's partner has recently passed away and they're wearing their partner's wedding ring. And the whole time they're talking, they're doing this. They're saying, no, you know, I'm fine. I think it's going to be great. I think that, you know, I've totally gotten over this. And every single time they're touching this ring, like then suddenly you're showing a great deal about that character's emotional space that they are not conveying. And I think that's a really interesting way to show that. Because the truth is human beings are not as willing to say how we really feel as we like to think we are. And so showing a character who can't quite say what they really feel through objects and action is such a great moment as a reader, I think, because it makes me feel smart. It makes me feel connected to that person because I too cannot always say what I feel. And so I use a lot of that. I think that's a great technique. Okay, I think we are done with all of these goodies. I hope it's really hard to not see your faces because I can't tell if this was useful, but I hope that it was super useful. I often write about writing game design on the mcg.montecookgames.com site and on my own site, shannagermain.com, about more fiction stuff. So feel free to come along there. Charles, do you have closing stuff to say too?
Only stuff that we've said before. If you missed the very beginning, you know what, maybe I can just paste it back in. That'll take a minute. I put in the link way at the top of the chat for the outline and the resources document divided. So if you missed that, it's way at the top of the chat, or I will give me just a minute and I'll see if I can dig the link back up and put it in there. And then, as I said before, we will have a recording of the chat of the seminar, which we'll make available in within a few days, I think. As long as however much time it takes us to kind of edit it up, clean it up, and get it ready for you. And I think that's about it.
So probably by tomorrow I'll update the resource list. So if you want to wait and download it again, then it'll have the goodies. And if you write something and you have a great time, let me know. I'd love to hear like if something helped you or got you through a tough writing patch or something like that. That would be awesome. All right, I think we're done. Thank you guys so much for joining us. This was really fun.
Yes, thank you so much. There's the links to the documents, and I guess what we'll do, Shanna, if you want to just step on out, that's fine. I'll just leave the seminar open for another couple of minutes in case anything went around out of the comments or whatever.
Sounds good. I hope you guys make a writing group. That would be awesome. That's all. Okay, bye guys.